Well, I'm something of an outlier inside the foreign policy community, in that I usually have a contrarian view in terms of most of the policies that the establishment, the foreign policy establishment, pursues. For example, I was against the Iraq War. I was in favor of getting out of Afghanistan almost immediately after toppling the Taliban, and I was firmly against taking military action in Iran. More generally, I was deeply opposed to the basic policy that we pursued during the unipolar moment. This is from roughly 1992, the year after the Soviet Union collapsed, up until about 2017, when the system became multipolar. But during that unipolar moment, we pursued a policy called liberal hegemony, which was basically designed to remake the world over in our own image. And I was adamantly opposed to that policy. That meant that I was adamantly opposed to NATO expansion, to include bringing Ukraine into the alliance. I was certainly adamantly opposed to engagement with China, where we did everything possible to make China rich on the mistaken belief that China, as it became more prosperous, would become more peaceful. So there are a whole slew of policies that the foreign policy establishment, and of course actually administrations, have pursued since the Cold War ended, that I have been deeply opposed to. I think what's going on here is I'm a person who believes that a great power like the United States should mainly be concerned about other great powers in the system. And the last thing that it wants to do is get involved in wars in what we used to call the developing world or the third world, to put it in slightly different terms. Not getting involved in wars against minor powers like Iraq or Afghanistan or Iran, because this leads to unending trouble. And I think, by the way, this is a reflection of the fact that I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which was coterminous with the Vietnam War. And I learned as a young man, maybe even an older boy, in those years, that you want to stay out of places like Vietnam.
This is breaking
when you get into
news.
Vietnam, you're jumping into a quagmire. And I think that experience has heavily influenced my thinking over the years.
This
so
is
I'm one of these
breaking
people
news.
who mainly believes that the United States should worry about countries like Russia and
This
China,
is
and of course the
big
Soviet
breaking
Union during the
news.
Cold War, because they were great powers, and great powers compete with each other. And as an American, I
Iran
was concerned that
Zindabad.
we win that competition. But at the same time, I wanted
Iran
to make sure that we
Zindabad.
avoided the Vietnams that we might get ourselves into. So I think that's the sort of basic theme that runs through my work or runs through my mind when I think about the world.
America
Let me say a
is
few words
breaking
about
news.
Iran. I think that what the administration, the U.S. administration and the Israelis were
This
interested
is
in
breaking
doing
news.
was creating regime change. And I think the Israelis
Iran
actually went
Zindabad.
and they preferred to not do simple
Wow.
regime change, but to make Iran look like Syria, to break it up into constituent parts. But we were unwilling, both the Israelis and the Americans, to put ground forces in to do that, so that we thought we could do
Trump
it
in
with air power
panic.
alone. That was the basic goal here. Absolutely.
Trump
The
in
evidence is
panic.
unequivocally clear. And it was quite shocking that, therefore, President Trump went to war
This
against
is
Iran
breaking
with this goal in
news.
mind. It was almost guaranteed to fail. And not only is the historical record clear,
Netanyahu in panic.
but it's quite clear that the deep state in this case, the military, and here we're talking about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and people in the Pentagon of consequence, as well as the intelligence community. And here the main player that we know about is the National Intelligence Council. They were all warning
This is
President
breaking
Trump that
news.
this was a fool's errand and that we did not have a viable option.
This is
Nevertheless, he
breaking
did.
news.
And, that brings us back to your question of where we are in the war now. And the fact is that we have not,
Iran in
despite the
action.
initial decapitation of the Iranian leadership, caused regime change. And in fact, if anything, almost everybody agrees that there's been a rally around the flag effect inside of Iran. And Iran is therefore, the Iranian regime is therefore more stable, more locked
Hezbollah
in
in
today
action.
than it was before the war started on February 28th. So we have failed to achieve our basic goal.
This
and
is
instead of getting that
breaking
quick and
news.
decisive victory that the Israelis and the Americans thought they were going to achieve, we're now in a war of attrition.
This
And
is breaking
in a war of attrition,
news.
it's the Iranians who hold the cards, not the Americans.
I want to come back to that, but let me talk about the president's entry
Iran
into the war. Do you
Zindabad.
think that he had somehow been impacted by the success of the Maduro capture? And secondly, by how he perceived the June war?
Iran is
I think
totally
those two things
war.
mattered for sure, but I think that's not the principal reason that he went in. I think the principal
Iran
reason that he
in
went in
totally
is because
war.
the Israelis and a handful of their supporters in the United States convinced him that we could win a quick and decisive victory, that we could get regime change. And the New York Times recently had a lengthy article that spelled out what happened here. And it turns out that the
This
president
is
head of
breaking
Mossad, David
news.
Barnea, came to believe that if the United States
This is
and
breaking
Israel
news.
launched this decapitation strategy, or you might want to call it a shock and awe strategy, right off the bat, that the end result would be revolution in the
called the
streets
Third
in Iran,
World
and
War.
the regime would be toppled. Now, people inside the administration, inside the deep state,
Wow.
did not believe that, as I said before. And actually, as the Times tells the
Wow.
story, David Barnea, who's the head of Mossad, his predecessor, Yossi Cohen, believed that this was
Iran
a delusional
Zindabad.
strategy. Cohen believed that this would not work. But Barnea
Iran
comes in and he does a
Zindabad.
180-degree turn regarding the policy. And it's very
This
clear
is
that
breaking
Barnea
news.
influenced both Netanyahu and especially President Trump to
Israeli
think that
army
this
in
strategy
panic.
would work.
Even though you're suggesting that perhaps the members of the deep state in America told the president no.
Well, to say that they said no
This is
a bit too
breaking
strong.
news.
We want to choose our words carefully here. I think that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff told President Trump, and by the way, you want to remember that the chairman was handpicked by President
Panic
Trump.
in Gulf
President Trump
country.
came in, he fired the existing chair, General Brown, and he replaced him with a 3-star general, not a 4-star general,
Wow.
a 3-star general who was retired and had never even been considered for the position. He was promoted to 4 stars by President Trump and put in the position of chair. He, despite the fact that he'd been picked by President Trump, told President
This
Trump
is
that he did not
breaking
have a viable
news.
military option. And of course, the National Intelligence Council told
Mostly
President
Kuwait
Trump that the
and
idea that we
Saudi
would get
Arab.
regime change was a pipe dream. It was not
Mostly
going to happen.
Kuwait
So that's
and
the deep
Saudi
state
Arab.
speaking.
My understanding is that prior
This is
that
breaking
the support
news.
for the regime was, around 12 or 15%. Now that may be wrong, but this was before
Wow.
the attack. And as you said, people rally around their country when they're under attack.
Iran
A couple
Zindabad.
points, Charlie. First of all, as you pointed out, there's never been a regime attack that has been caused by air power alone. Second is, those
This
people who
is
say
breaking
that the
news.
regime only has support from about 12 to 15% of the people are individuals or
This is
organizations who want
breaking
us to attack
news.
Iran. Those are the kind of arguments you make if you're interested in attacking Iran. And as you know, it's very hard to figure out what's going on inside of this war because there's so much propaganda coming
Iran
from both
attack
sides.
on
And because they
America,
shut down all
partner country.
internet everywhere.
Yeah, that's certainly true in Iran, that the internet is frequently shut down. And in the case of the Israelis, they have had wicked censorship, and they have been
Wow.
pretty successful up until the last day or two at making that censorship work. It's now becoming clear that the Israelis are really being pounded by Iranian
Iran in
missiles.
full action.
They've effectively run out of defensive missiles. But up until the last day or two, you could not tell whether that was happening or not. And maybe it wasn't happening. Maybe the missiles are only now getting through. I point this out simply because it tells you how hard it is to know what the true story is. But my sense is, from reading the papers, listening to various podcasts and so forth and so on, that there is substantial support.
This
for the
is
regime inside
breaking
of
news.
Iran. There's also substantial
Post-attack.
No, pre-attack.
Oh, pre-attack, okay.
Pre-attack. I think there was substantial support for the regime inside of Iran, pre-attack, and substantial opposition. I don't dispute that for 1 second. And by the way, we would go into great lengths to create that opposition. That was the
America
purpose of the
defense
sanctions policy.
power is
Trying to
failed.
manipulate their currency last December 2025. We're trying to inflict massive pain on the Iranian population to get them to rise up. But nevertheless, there were a lot of people who were deeply opposed to the Iranian government or the Iranian regime. But the point is, I don't think it was 12 to 15%. But even if it was,
Totally
it is
was
quite
in
clear that once the
Middle
bombing starts,
East.
and once you start targeting people, which invariably happens, and once you start going after cultural sites and destroying cultural sites, you're going to get a wicked rally around the flag effect. And all the evidence is that that's what you're getting. And this gets back to your point that there's been no successful case of a bombing campaign.
This
that
is
caused
bad
regime change.
news
And that's
for
largely because
India.
bombing a population does things to that population that causes a rally around the flag effect. So if you're interested in regime change, what you invariably have to do is put boots on the ground. But once you do boots on the ground, you're then in a forever war. And we know that that's the last thing we want. No Vietnam, no Afghanistan, no Iraq. So that's why we're now between a rock and a hard place.
Do you think the president is looking for an exit?
Absolutely. I think he's desperate for an exit. Listen, let me just
And
say,
you can't find
This
one.
is bad news for world
and by the way, I
economy.
think if you or I were playing Iran's hand, we would not want to end the war. The longer the war goes on, the worse it is for the United States and for Israel. Therefore, if you're Iran, you want to prolong the war. You want to increase your leverage. Let me tell you a quick story.
I mean, they clearly are hurting a lot.
They are hurting. They are hurting. There's no question about that. But you have to remember that Iran faces an existential threat here. Israel and the United Exactly. As I said to you before, the Israelis for sure. I think maybe
What now happened?
the state apart. We'd like to wreck Iran. The Israelis certainly want to wreck Iran. This is an existential threat. They have very few friends in the neighborhood. They have all these Arab Gulf states that are arrayed against them. So if you're the Iranians facing an existential threat, you're now in a war, and you're doing very well in that war. You're inflicting great pain on the international economy, which is another way of saying you're inflicting great pain on the United States. You're destroying American military bases in the region.
Israel is happy
pain
for
not only on the
America
Gulf
war.
states themselves, but on Israel as well. Why would you quit? Why not just keep going? Inflict more and more pain. Make the Americans and the Israelis increasingly desperate. That would be the smart thing to do, I think, if you're playing Iran's hand. It's not in our interest, for sure. It's certainly not President Trump's interest. But from their point of view, given all the leverage they now have,
Keep silent and listen this news.
Charlie, let me just tell you one very quick story. Remember the 12-day war last year? This was between June 13th and June 25th, when Israel and the United States went to war against Iran. The war ended after 12 days for two main reasons. One, the Israelis were beginning to run out of interceptors, and the Israelis asked President Trump to end the conflict.
Today for Iran
President Trump
and
got
Gaza.
that the Iranians were thinking about shutting down the Gulf, shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. He got cold feet. So the war ended.
Because he knew what impact it would have on energy prices.
Yes, and we should talk in a minute about why that basic logic didn't work this time. But let's just stick with the 12-day war for a second, because this is very important. At the time, when the Israelis
Today
and the
for
Americans were
Iran
going to end it after 12 days,
support
a lot of
is-
people said, and I was one of them, that the Iranians were foolish, from their point of view, to end the war. Because they were now at a point where they were blasting through Israeli defenses and inflicting significant punishment on Israel itself, which of course is why Netanyahu wanted to shut the war down. And at the same time, they could have continued to threaten, not necessarily shut the strait, but continued to threaten back then, which would have really spooked President Trump, and I believe
This
would have
is
given them
damage
much
time
more leverage
for
in the
Iran.
final deal. So you have a similar logic at play here, where I say that the Iranians have a vested interest in continuing this war, not shutting it down.
The fact that people didn't rise up, was it because of nationalism, or was it because they were fearful of being shot in the streets or machine gunned in the streets? Because the reports are that 30,000 people were killed when they
This
rose
is
up
bad
against the
news for
Let me just
America.
start by saying I think the number 30,000 is much, much too large.
regime. What do you think it is?
Oh, I don't know, but I would imagine it's a couple thousand at most.
Really?
But your basic point still holds. We don't want to quibble over numbers, right? Your basic point still holds. My response to what you said is that these explanations are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they reinforce each other,
Wow.
right? Just think about what you said. They reinforce each other, and that's why you're not getting regime change.
Who's running Iran?
Well, as best you can tell from the outside,
This is
it's the
bad
Revolutionary Guard,
news.
and it's the
And not
Mark.
necessarily the Ayatollah, the new Ayatollah, the son of the deceased Ayatollah, because we really haven't heard from him at all.
Exactly. That's why your question, which is a great question, is so difficult to answer. I mean, we're really not too sure.
And if it was Ali Arajani, he's dead as well.
Yes. And
Thanks
very
for
importantly
watching my video.
It's significant that we have killed almost all of the moderates in the context of Iranian politics. Ayatollah Khamenei, who we killed on February 28th, is considerably more
Very,
moderate than
very
his son.
thank you.